In the scorching heat of a Jerusalem summer in 1170, a 9-year-old prince named Baldwin stood in the courtyard of the royal palace, surrounded by the children of the nobility. The game they played was simple and cruel, as children's games often are. They would pinch and scratch each other's arms with their fingernails, competing to see who could endure the most pain without crying out. The other boys yelped and laughed as they inflicted and received their small torments. But Prince Baldwin remained eerily silent, even as his companions dug their nails deep into his flesh. Watching from the shade of a colonnade was William of Tyre, the most learned man in the kingdom of Jerusalem, who had been entrusted with the prince's education. William was a sophisticated scholar who had studied in the great universities of Paris and Bologna, a man who spoke multiple languages and understood both Eastern and Western ways of thinking. As he observed the children at play, something about young Baldwin's behavior troubled him deeply. The prince's stoic acceptance of pain seemed unnatural, even for a boy being groomed for kingship. When William called Baldwin aside and began to examine his arms, the terrible truth became apparent. The boy's right arm and hand were partially numb. He could feel neither the pinching nor even biting. This was no display of royal fortitude or exceptional bravery. It was the beginning of one of medieval Europe's most feared and misunderstood diseases. Baldwin, heir to the throne of the most important Christian kingdom in the East, was showing the first signs of leprosy. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. This discovery would set in motion one of history's most remarkable stories. The tale of a young king who, despite suffering from a disease that made him an outcast in the eyes of medieval society, would rise to become one of the greatest military commanders of his age and the only leader capable of holding Jerusalem against the legendary Saladin. It is a story that begins in the luxurious palaces of Crusader Jerusalem and ends with the tragic collapse of a kingdom, all centered around a man who defied every expectation of what a medieval king should be. Baldwin IV was born into a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty in 1161, in the heart of medieval Jerusalem, a city that had been transformed by Christian conquest into something unique in the medieval world. The Jerusalem of Baldwin's childhood was not the dusty, impoverished settlement often depicted in popular imagination, but rather one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan cities of its time. The royal palace where he grew up was a marvel of architecture that blended Western European grandeur with Eastern refinement. The palace itself, completed during Baldwin's childhood in the 1160s, was located adjacent to the Citadel of David and represented the pinnacle of Crusader architectural achievement. Unlike the dark, defensive castles of Western Europe, this palace was designed for comfort and representation rather than siege warfare. Its walls were not the thick, windowless barriers typical of European fortifications, but rather featured large, glazed windows that flooded the rooms with Jerusalem's brilliant sunlight. The glass for these windows came from the renowned glassmaking centers of Tyre and Beirut, and the quality was so fine that visitors often marveled at the clarity and beauty of the transparency. The floors of the royal apartments were decorated with intricate mosaics, many inherited from the previous Byzantine and Islamic rulers, but enhanced with Christian imagery and Western heraldic symbols. Polychrome marble columns, often salvaged from Roman ruins, supported graceful arches in halls that were cool even during the heat of summer, thanks to careful design that promoted cross-ventilation. Gardens surrounded the palace complex, filled not with the familiar plants of Western Europe, but with exotic citrus trees, pomegranates, palms, oleander, and hibiscus that perfumed the air with unfamiliar fragrances. This was the world into which Baldwin was born, the son of King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. His birth name carried the weight of crusading history. He was named after his great-uncle, King Baldwin III, who had joked that his christening present would be nothing less than the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. It was a prophecy that would prove both accurate and tragically complex. Baldwin's early childhood was marked by political upheaval and personal displacement. His mother, Agnes of Courtenay, came from one of the most powerful families among the crusading nobility. The Courtenays had been intimately connected with the royal house since the earliest days of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Agnes's father, Jocelyn II of Courtenay, had been Count of Edessa until that frontier principality fell to Muslim reconquest, leaving the Courtenay family as noble exiles with grand titles but limited lands. The marriage between Amalric and Agnes had been a love match, unusual in an age when royal marriages were typically arranged for political advantage. Contemporary accounts describe how the young couple seemed genuinely devoted to each other, producing 2 children, Baldwin and his sister Sibylla, within the first few years of their marriage. However, this happiness was not destined to last. When King Baldwin III died unexpectedly in 1163, Amalric stood to inherit the throne, but the High Court of Jerusalem, composed of the kingdom's bishops and most powerful barons, refused to crown him as long as he remained married to Agnes. The reasons for this demand remained controversial, even among contemporary chroniclers, with some suggesting fears about Agnes's political ambitions and others pointing to concerns about her family's influence over royal patronage. The official reason given was consanguinity, the claim that Amalric and Agnes were too closely related to be married according to church law. But this justification was so flimsy that even William of Tyre, writing years later, had to ask Agnes's aunt to explain the relationship that supposedly made the marriage invalid. Faced with a choice between his wife and his crown, Amalric reluctantly agreed to the annulment. The ecclesiastical court that dissolved the marriage made certain to legitimize Baldwin and Sibylla, ensuring their rights to inheritance. But the personal cost was devastating. At the age of 2, Baldwin lost his mother, who was forced to leave the royal court and remarry, first to Hugh of Ibelin and later to Reginald of Sidon. Agnes would not return to her son's life for more than a decade, leaving Baldwin to be raised by his father's new wife, Maria Komnenos, a Byzantine princess who had little affection for her stepchildren. Despite the personal disruptions of his early childhood, Baldwin's education proceeded with the care befitting a future king. King Amalric, perhaps feeling guilty about the circumstances of his son's separation from his mother, was determined to provide Baldwin with the finest education available in the medieval world. At the age of 9, the prince was entrusted to William of Tyre, a man whose intellectual accomplishments made him one of the most qualified tutors in Christendom. William's own educational background read like a catalogue of 12th century Europe's greatest centers of learning. He had spent a decade studying liberal arts and theology in Paris and Orléans, with professors who had been students of the greatest masters of the age, Thierry of Chartres, Gilbert de la Porree, Peter Lombard, and Maurice de Sully. His legal education had been completed at Bologna under the 4 doctors, who were establishing the foundations of medieval jurisprudence. This combination of theological, philosophical, and legal training made William uniquely qualified to prepare a future king for the complex challenges of ruling a multicultural, multilingual kingdom. Under William's tutelage, Baldwin proved to be an exceptionally gifted student. Contemporary accounts describe him as having an excellent memory, quick understanding, and a remarkable ability to absorb complex information. He was fluent in French, the language of the nobility, and Latin, the language of the church and administration. But he also acquired at least a working knowledge of Arabic and Greek, languages essential for a ruler in the multicultural kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin's education went far beyond academic learning. Understanding that a Frankish king in the East needed to be more than a scholar, Amalric also arranged for his son to receive practical training in the military arts. The king hired Arab instructors, including the physician Abu Sulayman Dawood and the writing master Abul Khair, to teach Baldwin the skills he would need as a warrior king. This decision to employ Muslim tutors was characteristic of the cultural flexibility that had allowed the Crusader states to survive and prosper in a hostile environment. The writing lessons proved particularly important, and not just for the obvious reasons. Learning to control a destrier, the massive war horse that was the foundation of a medieval heavy cavalry, required extraordinary skill and strength under the best of circumstances. For Baldwin, whose right hand and arm were increasingly affected by his developing leprosy, the challenge was even greater. He had to learn to control his mount using primarily his knees and his left hand, a technique that required years of practice and exceptional balance. That he mastered this skill despite his disability speaks to both his determination and his natural athletic ability. Baldwin's personality during these formative years was marked by a curious combination of optimism and realism. William of Tyre, who knew him better than anyone during this period, described him as precocious and determined, a young man who faced his illness with remarkable courage. The prince possessed what medieval observers called good grace. He was handsome, well-built, and carried himself with the natural dignity expected of royalty. Yet he also displayed an exceptional memory for both kindnesses and slights, a trait that would serve him well in the complex world of medieval politics. Despite his royal status, Baldwin's childhood was not entirely sheltered from the realities of his disease. Medieval medical knowledge offered no effective treatment for leprosy, though physicians tried various remedies, including repeated fomentations, ointments, and even poisonous drugs, in desperate attempts to halt the progression of his condition. Each failed treatment must have been a reminder to the young prince of his uncertain future. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that he never allowed despair to overwhelm him. The political education Baldwin received from William of Tyre was as important as his academic and military training. William was not merely a scholar, but an active participant in the kingdom's governance, serving as chancellor and eventually as Archbishop of Tyre. Through William, Baldwin learned the complex art of balancing the competing interests of the various factions within his father's court. The established noble families who had arrived with the First Crusade, the more recent arrivals from Western Europe, the military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, and the native Christian populations who had lived in the region for centuries. This education in practical politics would prove invaluable, for Baldwin was growing up during a period of increasing external pressure on the Crusader states. Throughout his childhood, the various Muslim powers surrounding the Kingdom of Jerusalem were gradually being unified under the leadership of a Kurdish general named Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Better known to history as Saladin, by the time Baldwin reached adolescence, Saladin had established himself as Sultan of Egypt and was systematically extending his control over Syria, creating for the first time in generations a unified Muslim power capable of challenging the Crusader state's very existence. Everything changed for Baldwin on July 11th, 1174, when King Amalric died suddenly of dysentery while campaigning near Damascus. The 13-year-old prince, still showing only the earliest signs of his leprosy, was thrust onto the throne of Jerusalem at one of the most dangerous moments in the kingdom's 75-year history. The timing could hardly have been worse. Saladin was in the process of consolidating his control over Muslim Syria and Egypt, creating a unified threat that the divided and weakened Crusader states were ill-equipped to meet. The coronation of Baldwin IV took place on July 15, 1174, just 4 days after his father's death, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The ceremony was both magnificent and poignant. A 13-year-old boy, already showing signs of the disease that would define his reign, being invested with the responsibility of defending Christianity's most sacred sites against one of history's greatest military commanders. The crown that was placed on his head had been worn by Godfrey of Bouillon, the hero of the First Crusade, and by the series of warrior kings who had carved out and defended the kingdom of Jerusalem for 3 generations. Due to his youth, Baldwin could not immediately assume full control of the kingdom. According to the constitutional practices of Jerusalem, a regent had to be appointed from among the king's closest male relatives. The logical choice was Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, an experienced military commander and politician who was Baldwin's nearest adult male relative. Raymond would govern the kingdom competently for the next 2 years, but his policies during this crucial period would have lasting consequences for Baldwin's reign. Raymond's approach to the growing threat posed by Saladin was essentially defensive and diplomatic. Recognizing that the Crusader states lacked the resources for a prolonged military confrontation with a unified Muslim power, Raymond negotiated a series of truces and agreements that he hoped would buy time for the kingdom to strengthen its defenses or receive reinforcements from Western Europe. In 1175, he concluded a formal peace treaty with Saladin that was heavily favorable to the Muslim leader. Jerusalem agreed not to support the Normans of Sicily, who were attacking Saladin's power base in Egypt, while Saladin was given free rein to consolidate his control over Syria. While this policy may have been realistic, given the kingdom's limited resources, it also allowed Saladin to complete his encirclement of the Crusader states without interference. By the time Baldwin came of age and was able to challenge Raymond's policies, Saladin controlled a continuous arc of territory from Egypt through Damascus and Aleppo, leaving the kingdom of Jerusalem vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. The young king's first opportunity to assert his independence came in 1176, when he reached the age of majority and formally assumed full control of the government. One of Baldwin's first acts as king in his own right was to reject the peace that Raymond had made with Saladin and to adopt a more aggressive stance toward the Muslim threat. This decision demonstrated both political courage and strategic insight. Baldwin understood that Saladin's growing power made a future confrontation inevitable, and that it was better to fight while the kingdom still retained some military advantages, rather than wait for Saladin to complete his preparations. Baldwin's new policy was immediately put to the test. In late 1176, he launched a raid against the lands surrounding Damascus, forcing Saladin to abandon his own campaign in northern Syria and adopt a defensive posture. This was the young king's first independent military command, and its success demonstrated that despite his youth and illness, he possessed both the strategic vision and the personal courage necessary for effective leadership. The political ramifications of Baldwin's assumption of power went beyond military policy. His mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who had been excluded from his life since his early childhood, now returned to court and quickly established herself as one of the most influential figures in the kingdom. Agnes had spent the years of her exile building a network of political alliances through her subsequent marriages and through careful cultivation of relationships with key figures in both the nobility and the clergy. Agnes's return created new factional tensions within the royal court. Her supporters, who included her brother Jocelyn of Courtenay and various newcomers to the kingdom, found themselves in competition with the established nobility who had governed during Raymond's regency. This factional struggle would be one of the defining features of Baldwin's reign, as competing groups maneuvered for influence over the young king and for control of the succession. Given Baldwin's inability to produce heirs due to his leprosy, the greatest triumph of Baldwin's reign, and perhaps one of the most remarkable military victories of the entire crusading period, came in November 1177 at a place called Montgisard, near the modern town of Tel Safi. The battle was born from Saladin's confidence that the time had finally come to strike a decisive blow against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. With most of the kingdom's military forces committed to a campaign in the north with Philip of Flanders, and with the 16-year-old Leper King apparently trapped in the fortress of Ascalon with only a handful of knights, Saladin saw an opportunity to march directly on Jerusalem itself. Saladin's army was massive by the standards of Crusader warfare. Contemporary sources estimate between 20,000 and 26,000 men, including the elite Mamluk cavalry that formed the backbone of Ayyubid military power. The Sultan had spent months planning this campaign, timing it to coincide with the absence of the kingdom's main army, and confident that Baldwin's small force could offer no meaningful resistance. As his army crossed from Egypt into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Saladin allowed his men to spread out over a wide area to forage and collect booty, confident that no Christian force could threaten such a massive army. Baldwin's situation in Ascalon appeared desperate. The king was suffering from both his advancing leprosy and an attack of malaria that had left him weak and barely able to remain in the saddle. His available forces numbered only about 375 knights and several thousand infantry, a tiny fraction of Saladin's army. Most medieval commanders would have remained behind the walls of Ascalon and hoped for the best. But Baldwin understood that allowing Saladin to march unopposed to Jerusalem would mean the end of the Crusader kingdom. The young king's response demonstrated both strategic brilliance and extraordinary personal courage. Rather than remaining passive, Baldwin issued an arriere ban, a rarely used legal device that summoned every able-bodied man in the kingdom to military service under threat of losing all feudal rights. This desperate measure allowed him to gather additional forces, though his army remained vastly outnumbered. More importantly, Baldwin made the crucial decision to break out of Ascalon and pursue Saladin's army, even though this meant abandoning the safety of the fortress walls for open battle against impossible odds. The march from Ascalon toward the Muslim army was a race against time. Baldwin, despite his illness, insisted on leading from the front, though contemporary accounts describe him as so weak that he had to be helped onto his horse and supported in the saddle. The sight of their young king, visibly ill but determined to fight for his kingdom, had a powerful effect on the morale of the Christian forces. Here was a leader who, despite suffering from a disease that made him an outcast in medieval society, was willing to risk everything for his people. The Christian army caught up with Saladin's forces near Montgisard on November 25, 1177. The timing was perfect. Saladin's army was spread out over several miles, with many units engaged in foraging rather than prepared for battle. The Muslim commander had grown overconfident, believing that Baldwin's small force posed no significant threat. This tactical error would prove catastrophic. According to contemporary accounts, Baldwin ordered the relic of the true cross, the most sacred object in the kingdom of Jerusalem, to be raised before his army as they prepared for battle. The king himself, despite his physical weakness, dismounted and knelt before the cross in prayer while his entire army watched. The sight of their teenage king, his body ravaged by disease but his spirit unbroken, kneeling in supplication before Christianity's most holy relic, created a moment of religious and military fervor that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe. The battle itself was swift and decisive. Baldwin's army, inspired by their king's example, and fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced annihilation if they failed, struck Saladin's forces while they were dispersed and unprepared. The king of Jerusalem, despite being carried on a litter due to his illness, was reported to be in the thick of the fighting, his bandaged hands gripping his weapon as he led his men against their enemies. The Muslim army, caught completely off guard, collapsed with stunning rapidity. Saladin himself barely escaped capture, fleeing the battlefield on the back of a swift camel, while his army disintegrated around him. Contemporary estimates suggest that as much as 90% of Saladin's force was killed or captured, while only a small remnant managed to escape back to Egypt with their commander. The victory was so complete that it temporarily shattered Saladin's reputation and forced him to spend years rebuilding both his army and his political position. The Battle of Montgisard became legendary throughout both the Christian and Muslim worlds. For the Crusader states, it represented proof that God still favored their cause, and that even seemingly impossible odds could be overcome through faith, courage, and effective leadership. For Baldwin personally, it established his reputation as a military commander of extraordinary ability, someone who could achieve decisive victories, despite physical limitations that would have ended most medieval careers. The psychological impact of the victory may have been even more important than its immediate military consequences. Montgisard demonstrated that Saladin, despite his growing power, was not invincible, and that the kingdom of Jerusalem still possessed leaders capable of defending it against the greatest threats. The victory bought precious time for the kingdom and significantly delayed Saladin's timetable for conquest. The years following Montgisard were marked by a gradual but relentless progression of Baldwin's leprosy, even as he continued to demonstrate exceptional skill as both a military commander and a political leader. By 1179, just 2 years after his greatest triumph, the physical toll of his disease was becoming increasingly apparent. William of Tyre, who chronicled Baldwin's condition with the careful attention of both a loyal subject and a trained observer, noted that the king's extremities and face were becoming increasingly affected. The medieval understanding of leprosy was a mixture of medical observation and religious interpretation that created a complex set of social and political challenges for Baldwin. The disease was widely believed to be a punishment for sin, which created theological difficulties for a king who was supposed to be God's appointed representative on earth. Yet Baldwin's continued military successes and his obvious personal piety seemed to contradict this interpretation, creating a paradox that medieval chroniclers struggled to explain. From a medical perspective, modern analysis suggests that Baldwin's condition progressed from what would now be classified as tuberculoid or polyneuritic leprosy, characterized primarily by numbness and nerve damage, to the more severe lepromatous form that caused the disfigurement and complications that marked his later years. The progression was gradual but inexorable, affecting first his extremities and then spreading to his face and other parts of his body. Despite the advancing disease, Baldwin continued to lead military campaigns in person, even when he could no longer walk unaided or use his hands effectively. The image of the young king being carried into battle on a litter, inspiring his troops through sheer force of will, despite his physical limitations, became one of the most powerful symbols of the Crusader period. Contemporary observers, both Christian and Muslim, were struck by the contrast between Baldwin's physical weakness and his undiminished mental acuity and spiritual strength. The year 1179 brought both military challenges and personal setbacks for Baldwin. In June of that year, Saladin achieved a measure of revenge for Montgessard at the Battle of Marj Ayoun, where the Muslim commander decisively defeated a Crusader force that included Baldwin, Raymond III of Tripoli, and Odo of Saint Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. The battle demonstrated that Saladin had learned from his earlier defeat and was no longer willing to underestimate the young king of Jerusalem. The defeat at Marj Ayoun was followed by an even more serious setback at Jacob's Ford, where Saladin successfully besieged and destroyed a fortress that Baldwin had been constructing to control a crucial crossing point on the Jordan River. The siege was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, with Saladin's forces using sophisticated sapping techniques to undermine the castle's walls, while Baldwin's relief force was still gathering at Tiberias. The loss at Jacob's Ford was particularly devastating because of the human cost. Over 700 knights, architects, and construction workers were killed in the assault, while another 800 were taken captive. The psychological impact of the defeat was significant. It demonstrated that Baldwin, despite his reputation as a brilliant military commander, was not invincible, and that Saladin had regained much of the prestige he had lost at Montgessard. Archaeological evidence from the Jacob's Ford site, discovered only in recent decades, provides graphic testimony to the ferocity of Saladin's assault. Human skeletal remains found within the fortress show evidence of horrific wounds. One skull bears 3 separate sword cuts, the last of which split the head and crushed the brain, while another warrior's arm was chopped off above the elbow before he was dispatched. These grim findings underscore the brutal reality of medieval warfare and the terrible price paid by the men who followed Baldwin into battle. Yet even these defeats demonstrated Baldwin's exceptional qualities as a leader. Rather than allowing military setbacks to crush his spirit or undermine his authority, the king used them as learning experiences that made him a more effective commander. His analysis of the failures at Marj Ayoun and Jacob's Ford led to tactical innovations that would serve him well in later campaigns. As Baldwin's physical condition deteriorated, the question of succession became increasingly urgent and complex. The king's leprosy made it clear that he would never marry or produce children, making his sister Sibylla the heir apparent to the throne. However, according to the feudal laws of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, female rulers were required to marry so that their husbands could fulfill the military obligations that went with royal power. This meant that Sibylla's choice of husband would effectively determine who would rule the kingdom after Baldwin's death. The search for a suitable husband for Sibylla had actually begun before Amalric's death, reflecting the royal family's early recognition of Baldwin's condition. Several prominent candidates had been considered and rejected for various reasons. Some lacked the political connections necessary to defend the kingdom. Others were deemed unreliable or potentially disloyal. The problem was complicated by the fractional nature of the kingdom's politics, with different noble families supporting different candidates based on their own interests and ambitions. The solution that was eventually chosen proved to be one of the most controversial decisions of Baldwin's reign. In 1180, at Easter, Sibylla was hastily married to Guy of Lusignan, a relatively unknown French knight who had only recently arrived in the Holy Land. The wedding was arranged so quickly that it was canonically irregular, and there was no public notice. Clear signs that it was being done to forestall some immediate political crisis. rather than as a carefully planned dynastic alliance. Guy of Lusignan was, on the surface, an odd choice for such an important position. He was the younger son of a minor noble family from Poitou, with no significant military experience and limited political connections in the East. His main qualifications seemed to be that he was a vassal of Henry II of England, which might potentially bring English support to the kingdom. However, Guy had also been banished from his homeland after killing Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, in a failed attempt to kidnap Eleanor of Aquitaine, which raised serious questions about his character and judgment. The real reason for the hasty marriage was revealed by later events. Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch had been preparing to invade Jerusalem during Holy Week 1180, apparently intending to force Baldwin to have Sibylla marry Baldwin of Ibelin, and then abdicate in favor of the new couple. This would have removed both Baldwin and his mother Agnes from power, replacing them with a local noble family. Guy and Sibylla's rapid marriage was designed to prevent this coup by presenting the conspirators with a fait accompli. Baldwin's initial attitude toward Guy was mixed. The king was naturally suspicious of a man who had gained such rapid advancement through marriage to the royal family, but he also recognized that Guy's lack of independent power base might make him easier to control than a more established noble. However, as Baldwin observed Guy's performance in various governmental and military roles, his opinion began to shift decidedly in a negative direction. The fundamental problem with Guy was his lack of competence in the skills most essential for medieval kingship: military leadership and political judgment. Contemporary chroniclers, even those generally favorable to the royal family, described Guy as weak, indecisive, and lacking in the personal charisma necessary to inspire loyalty among the kingdom's fractious nobility. These character flaws might have been manageable in a minor noble, but they were potentially catastrophic in a future king. Baldwin's growing concerns about Guy came to a head in 1183, when the king's deteriorating health forced him to make Guy regent with full executive authority. This appointment was intended to be a trial run for Guy's eventual assumption of the crown, but it quickly revealed the depth of his inadequacies as a leader. The crisis came when Saladin laid siege to Kerak Castle, one of the kingdom's most important frontier fortresses, and Guy proved unable to organize an effective relief expedition. The situation at Kerak was particularly delicate because the fortress was being besieged during a wedding celebration that included many members of the royal family and high nobility. Guy's failure to respond decisively to this crisis led to an unprecedented rebellion by the kingdom's military leaders. They collectively refused to follow Guy's commands and demanded that Baldwin resume personal control of the army, despite his desperate physical condition. This rebellion was essentially a vote of no confidence in Guy's leadership by the very people who would have to serve under him as king. Baldwin's response to this crisis demonstrated both his political wisdom and his personal courage. Despite being nearly blind and unable to walk or use his hands, the king had himself carried on a litter to lead the relief expedition personally. His mere presence at the head of the army was sufficient to convince Saladin to withdraw from Kerak, rather than risk a battle with unpredictable outcomes. This incident perfectly illustrated the contrast between Baldwin's natural authority and Guy's complete lack of leadership ability. Following the Kerak incident, Baldwin spent considerable effort attempting to have Sibylla's marriage to Guy annulled, recognizing that Guy's continued role in the succession would be disastrous for the kingdom. However, Sibylla refused to cooperate with these efforts, suggesting that her feelings for Guy were genuine rather than merely political. This created an intractable problem that Baldwin was never able to resolve. He could not legally disinherit his sister, but neither could he prevent her husband from eventually becoming king through marriage. Despite the political tensions surrounding the succession, Baldwin's court in Jerusalem remained one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan in the medieval world. The royal palace continued to be a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, merchants, diplomats, and adventurers from across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The contrast between the king's physical deterioration and the continued vitality of his court was one of the most striking features of his later reign. The palace itself had been expanded and beautified during Baldwin's reign, despite the constant military pressures facing the kingdom. The royal apartments featured the luxury typical of Eastern architecture: marble floors with intricate mosaic patterns, slender columns supporting graceful arches, and large windows filled with high-quality glass that allowed the Jerusalem sunlight to flood the interior spaces. The use of cross-ventilation and shaded courtyards kept the palace cool even during the heat of summer, while fountains and gardens provided both beauty and the soothing sound of running water. The daily routine of the court reflected the complex cultural blend that characterized the Crusader states. The king and his nobles spoke French among themselves, but the daily business of government was conducted in a mixture of languages that included Latin, Greek, Arabic, and various local dialects. This linguistic diversity was necessary for governing a population that included not only Western European settlers, but also Greek Orthodox Christians, various Eastern Christian sects, and Muslim populations in some areas. Baldwin's personal household was organized according to Western European models, but adapted to local conditions. The traditional offices of medieval courts, seneschal, constable, marshal, and chamberlain, were filled by members of the nobility who had both Western backgrounds and extensive experience in Eastern affairs. The king's daily schedule included the formal ceremonies typical of medieval courts, but these were modified to accommodate both his physical limitations and the unique requirements of ruling in the East. Despite his increasing blindness and loss of sensation in his hands and feet, Baldwin continued to participate actively in the ceremonial aspects of kingship that were essential for maintaining royal authority. Contemporary accounts describe how he would be carried into the throne room on a litter for important audiences, dressed in the purple robes that symbolized his royal dignity. Even when he could no longer stand unaided, his presence commanded respect and attention from both his own subjects and foreign visitors. The intellectual life of Baldwin's court was dominated by William of Tyre, who served not only as the king's former tutor, but also as chancellor and eventually as Archbishop of Tyre. William's Chronicle of the Kingdom, which provides our most detailed account of Baldwin's reign, was written partly to defend the king's reputation against critics who argued that a leper should not be allowed to rule. The Chronicle is both a historical record and a sophisticated work of political propaganda, designed to demonstrate that Baldwin's achievements as king more than compensated for his physical afflictions. Other scholars and clerics were also attracted to Baldwin's court, drawn by the king's reputation for learning and his patronage of intellectual pursuits. The royal library contained works in multiple languages, including not only the standard theological and philosophical texts of medieval Christendom, but also Arabic works on medicine, mathematics, and natural philosophy. This intellectual openness was characteristic of the Crusader states, where cultural exchange with the Muslim world continued even during periods of military conflict. The military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers maintained major establishments in Jerusalem, each with its own complex of buildings that rivaled the royal palace in size and magnificence. The Templars occupied the Temple Mount, where they had converted the Dome of the Rock into a church and used the former Al-Aqsa Mosque as their headquarters. The Hospitallers controlled a vast complex that included wards for over 2,000 patients, guest accommodations for pilgrims, administrative buildings, and barracks for their military forces. These military orders represented both assets and challenges for Baldwin's government. Their knights provided essential military support for the kingdom's defense, and their financial resources helped fund the constant warfare against Muslim neighbors. However, their independence from royal authority and their direct subordination to the Pope sometimes brought them into conflict with the kingdom's political leadership. Throughout Baldwin's reign, his primary antagonist was Saladin, the Kurdish general who had risen from relative obscurity to become the most powerful Muslim ruler of his generation. The relationship between these two remarkable leaders, one a teenage leper king defending a small Christian enclave, the other a mature military commander controlling vast territories from Egypt to Damascus, was complex and marked by a mixture of military conflict, diplomatic contact, and mutual respect. Saladin had been born around 1137 in Tikrit, making him nearly 25 years older than Baldwin. His rise to power had been gradual but inexorable, beginning with his service under his uncle Shirkuh in the armies of Nur ad-Din, the Muslim ruler of Syria. When Shirkuh died in Egypt in 1169, Saladin inherited his position as vizier to the Fatimid Caliph, but soon moved to consolidate control over Egypt under his own authority. By the time Baldwin became king, Saladin had already established himself as Sultan of Egypt and was systematically extending his control over the various Muslim principalities of Syria. His long-term goal was clear: to unite the Muslim world under his leadership, and then use that unified power to drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land entirely. This ambition put him on a collision course with Baldwin, whose survival depended on preventing exactly such a unification of Muslim power. The diplomatic relationship between Baldwin and Saladin was surprisingly complex, given that they were mortal enemies engaged in a struggle for the survival of their respective realms. When Baldwin's father died in 1174, Saladin actually sent a formal letter of condolence to the new king, a gesture that reflected both the diplomatic conventions of the time and a certain respect for the Crusader royal house. The letter, which has been preserved in Islamic historical sources, is remarkable for its courteous tone and its acknowledgement of Baldwin's legitimate authority as king. This diplomatic courtesy did not prevent the two rulers from engaging in ruthless warfare, but it may have contributed to a certain restraint in their methods that was not always present in medieval conflicts. Both Baldwin and Saladin were deeply religious men who saw their struggle in cosmic terms. Baldwin as a defender of Christianity's holiest sites, Saladin as a champion of Islamic unity and the recovery of Muslim lands. Yet both also demonstrated a pragmatic understanding of when negotiation was preferable to combat. Contemporary Muslim sources provide some insight into Saladin's view of his young opponent. The Sultan appears to have been impressed by Baldwin's military skills, particularly after the devastating defeat at Montgessard demonstrated that the Leper King was far more dangerous than his age and illness might suggest. Later Islamic chroniclers would describe Baldwin as a formidable opponent who deserved respect despite his faith, a recognition that was rare in medieval accounts of religious warfare. The strategic situation that both leaders faced was essentially a stalemate that favored the side with greater resources and patience. Baldwin's kingdom of Jerusalem was geographically compact and defensible, with strong fortifications and interior lines of communication that allowed rapid concentration of forces against any threat. However, the kingdom's population was small, and its military resources were limited. Every knight or man-at-arms lost in battle was difficult to replace. Saladin, by contrast, controlled vast territories with large populations, giving him access to virtually unlimited manpower. His challenge was logistical. Maintaining large armies in the field for extended periods was expensive and difficult, and his various subject peoples were not always enthusiastic about campaigns that primarily benefited Saladin's personal ambitions. This meant that both rulers had to be strategic in choosing when and where to fight, leading to a pattern of warfare that involved rapid campaigns, followed by periods of truce and negotiation. The personal toll of this extended conflict on both leaders was significant. Baldwin's physical condition continued to deteriorate throughout his reign, making each campaign more difficult than the last. Saladin, while physically healthy, faced constant political pressures from rivals within the Muslim world who were eager to exploit any sign of weakness or failure on his part. Both men understood that they were engaged in a struggle that would likely determine the long-term fate of their respective civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The last years of Baldwin's reign were marked by a series of increasingly desperate military campaigns as his physical condition deteriorated and the political stability of the kingdom began to break down. By 1182, the king was almost completely blind, had lost the use of his hands and feet, and was suffering from recurring fevers that left him weak and delirious. Yet even in this condition, he continued to lead his army in person, understanding that his presence on the battlefield was essential for maintaining the morale and unity of his forces. The campaign of 1182 culminated in the Battle of Le Forblay, which demonstrated both Baldwin's continuing tactical skill and the tragic limitations imposed by his condition. Contemporary accounts describe the king being carried into battle on a litter, completely unable to stand or fight, yet still commanding his forces through verbal orders and the sheer force of his presence. The battle ended in a tactical stalemate. Neither side could claim victory, but the sight of the Leper King refusing to yield despite his desperate condition had a profound impact on both armies. Perhaps the most dramatic example of Baldwin's extraordinary will came during the siege of Kerak in 1183, when Saladin surrounded the strategic fortress during a wedding celebration that included many members of the royal family. When Guy of Lusignan, who was serving as regent, proved unable to organize an effective relief expedition, the kingdom's nobles demanded that Baldwin resume personal command of the army, despite his near-total incapacitation. The march to Kerak was a testament to Baldwin's determination and to the loyalty he inspired in his followers. The king had to be carried on a litter throughout the journey, unable to see the countryside through which he passed, or to grip the reins of a horse. Yet his very presence at the head of the army transformed what might have been a demoralized and disorganized relief force into a cohesive military unit that even Saladin was unwilling to face in open battle. When Baldwin's army appeared on the horizon near Kerak, Saladin made the remarkable decision to abandon the siege rather than risk a battle with the Leper King. This decision reflected both military prudence — Baldwin's army was well organized and highly motivated — and a certain respect for an opponent who had demonstrated time and again that he was most dangerous when he appeared most vulnerable. The relief of Kerak would be Baldwin's last major military success, and it perfectly encapsulated the paradox of his reign. A king who had lost almost every physical capacity necessary for medieval warfare, yet remained one of the most effective military commanders of his age. The political aftermath of the Kerak campaign was as significant as its military outcome. Baldwin's successful assumption of command, despite Guy's failures, definitively demonstrated the regent's incompetence and effectively ended any possibility that Guy might inherit the throne with the support of the kingdom's military leadership. However, Baldwin's physical condition after the campaign made it clear that he would not live much longer. creating an urgent need to resolve the succession crisis. Baldwin's solution to this problem was both creative and desperate. Rather than allow Guy to inherit the throne through marriage to Sibylla, the king arranged for his nephew Baldwin V, Sibylla's son by her first marriage to William of Montferrat, to be crowned as co-king in 1183. This arrangement was designed to bypass Guy while still maintaining Sibylla's position in the succession, with Raymond III of Tripoli serving as regent for the child king. The coronation of Baldwin V was one of the most poignant scenes of medieval history. The ceremony took place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with the dying Leper King placing the crown on the head of his young nephew, while the kingdom's nobility looked on. Baldwin IV, now almost completely incapacitated by his disease, had to be supported throughout the ceremony. Yet his determination to secure the succession demonstrated his unwavering commitment to his kingdom's survival. Baldwin IV died on March 16, 1185, at the age of 24, after a reign of 11 years that had defied all expectations. The exact cause of death is uncertain, but medical historians suggest it was likely septicemia, resulting from infected ulcers that his leprosy-damaged immune system could no longer control. His death came at a moment when the Kingdom of Jerusalem appeared to be in a relatively stable position. The succession had been arranged, competent regents were in place, and Saladin had been held in check for over a decade. The funeral of the Leper King was a solemn affair that brought together representatives from across the Crusader states and beyond. Despite his disease, Baldwin was buried with full royal honors in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, his tomb placed among those of his predecessors who had ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem since its founding. Contemporary accounts describe the genuine grief displayed by his subjects, who recognized that they were losing not just a king, but the one leader who had proven capable of defending their precarious kingdom against overwhelming odds. Baldwin's death marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. His carefully planned succession arrangements quickly unraveled as the various factions he had spent years trying to balance began to pursue their own interests, without regard for the kingdom's overall survival. Baldwin V, the child king who was supposed to preserve the throne from Guy of Lusignan, died in 1186 at the age of 8, leaving the succession crisis unresolved. Sibylla's response to her son's death revealed the extent to which personal loyalty had triumphed over political necessity in her relationship with Guy. Rather than accepting the High Court's demand that she choose a new husband more suitable for kingship, Sibylla agreed to an annulment only on the condition that she be allowed to choose her replacement spouse. Once crowned as queen, she immediately announced that her choice was Guy of Lusignan himself, effectively nullifying the annulment and making Guy king despite the opposition of virtually all the kingdom's leading nobles. This deception split the kingdom into rival factions at the moment when unity was most essential. While some nobles grudgingly accepted Guy and Sibylla's usurpation of the throne, others began making plans to crown Sibylla's half-sister Isabella instead, creating the possibility of civil war at the very moment when Saladin was preparing his final assault on the Crusader states. The military consequences of Baldwin's death became apparent with shocking rapidity. Guy of Lusignan, now king but lacking both competence and the respect of his nobles, made a series of strategic blunders that culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187. The defeat was so complete that it effectively destroyed the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military capacity in a single day, with Guy himself among the prisoners taken by Saladin's forces. Within 3 months of Hattin, Saladin had captured Jerusalem itself on October 2, 1187. The conquest of the Holy City, which Baldwin had successfully defended for 11 years, despite overwhelming odds, sent shockwaves throughout Christendom and triggered the Third Crusade. However, the kingdom that Baldwin had ruled was gone forever. Although subsequent crusades would recover some coastal territories, the unified Christian kingdom that had existed since 1099 never fully recovered from the disasters that followed Baldwin's death. The irony of Baldwin's legacy is that his very success in holding the kingdom together may have masked the depth of its underlying problems. His extraordinary personal authority and military skill had compensated for structural weaknesses in the kingdom's political system and military organization that became fatal once they were no longer balanced by exceptional leadership. The factionalism, succession disputes, and strategic vulnerabilities that Baldwin had managed through force of personality and tactical brilliance proved insurmountable for his successors. Baldwin IV's story did not end with his death. Within decades of his passing, he had become a legendary figure throughout both Christian and Islamic cultures, remembered not for his physical afflictions, but for his extraordinary achievements as a military commander and king. Medieval chroniclers, both Western and Eastern, struggled to explain how someone so physically disabled could have been such an effective leader, creating a body of literature that transformed Baldwin from a historical figure into a symbol of courage, transcending adversity. Islamic historians, despite their natural bias against the Crusaders, often wrote of Baldwin with grudging respect. Al-Kalkashandi's preservation of Saladin's condolence letter demonstrates that even Baldwin's enemies recognized his legitimate authority and personal qualities. Later, Islamic chroniclers would describe him as a worthy opponent who deserved honor despite his faith, a remarkable assessment in an age when religious enemies were typically demonized rather than praised. In Western Europe, Baldwin's reputation grew over time as the full implications of his reign became apparent. Medieval chroniclers increasingly portrayed him as the last great king of Jerusalem, the man whose death marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader states. This interpretation was not entirely fair to his successors, but it reflected a recognition that Baldwin's combination of personal courage, military skill, and political wisdom had been truly exceptional. The medical aspects of Baldwin's condition also contributed to his legendary status. Medieval understanding of leprosy as divine punishment made his success as a king seem miraculous to contemporary observers. The fact that someone afflicted with what was considered a curse from God could achieve such remarkable victories suggested either that God had a special purpose for Baldwin or that conventional understanding of the leprosy was incomplete. Modern historians have generally been more measured in their assessment of Baldwin IV, recognizing both his remarkable achievements and the limitations imposed by his historical circumstances. His military victories, particularly at Montgisard, are acknowledged as tactically brilliant, but they are placed in the context of the broader strategic situation facing the Crusader states. His political skills are praised, but historians also note that his inability to resolve the succession crisis ultimately contributed to the kingdom's downfall. The archaeological evidence discovered at sites like Jacob's Ford has provided new insights into the nature of Baldwin's military campaigns and the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The skeletal remains found at Jacob's Ford, showing evidence of horrific wounds inflicted during Saladin's assault, serve as grim reminders of the human cost of the conflicts in which Baldwin was engaged. These discoveries have helped historians move beyond romanticized accounts of medieval warfare to a more realistic understanding of what Baldwin and his followers endured. Medical historians have used William of Tyre's detailed descriptions of Baldwin's condition to reconstruct the likely progression of his leprosy, providing insights into both medieval medical understanding and the actual physical challenges that Baldwin faced. These studies have confirmed that Baldwin's achievements were even more remarkable than medieval chroniclers realized, as modern medical knowledge makes clear just how debilitating his condition would have been in its advanced stages. The story of Baldwin IV continues to resonate in popular culture, inspiring works of historical fiction, documentaries, and films that often focus on the dramatic contrast between his physical limitations and his achievements as a leader. While these popular treatments sometimes romanticize or simplify his story, they reflect a continuing fascination with a historical figure who embodied themes of courage, determination, and the triumph of will over circumstance that remain compelling to modern audiences. Baldwin IV's reign lasted only 11 years, from 1174 to 1185, but its impact on the history of the medieval world was profound and lasting. In an age when physical prowess was considered essential for kingship, he demonstrated that intellectual ability, moral courage, and strategic vision could compensate for even the most severe physical limitations. His success in defending the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Saladin's early campaigns delayed the Muslim reconquest of the Holy Land by more than a decade, buying time that allowed Western Europe to organize and launch the Third Crusade. From a military perspective, Baldwin's campaigns revealed the continuing viability of Crusader tactical methods when properly employed by competent commanders. His victory at Montgisard demonstrated that smaller, well-led forces could still achieve decisive results against larger armies through superior tactics, surprise, and effective leadership. His defensive strategies, including the use of mobile forces to harass enemy supply lines and his careful attention to fortress construction and repair, became models for later Crusader commanders. Baldwin's political legacy was more complex and ultimately tragic. His efforts to balance the competing factions within his kingdom were remarkably successful during his lifetime, but they depended too heavily on his personal authority and charisma to survive his death. The succession crisis that he was unable to resolve ultimately contributed to the kingdom's downfall, as the political divisions he had managed to contain erupted into civil conflict at the moment when unity was most essential. Perhaps most significantly, Baldwin IV's reign challenged medieval assumptions about the relationship between physical condition and leadership ability. His success as a king, despite suffering from leprosy, forced contemporary observers to reconsider their understanding of both disease and kingship. While he did not completely overcome the stigma associated with leprosy, his achievements demonstrated that physical disability need not preclude effective leadership, a lesson that had implications far beyond the specific circumstances of the Crusader states. The ultimate tragedy of Baldwin's story is that his very success may have contributed to the kingdom's eventual failure. His extraordinary abilities as both a military commander and a political leader allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to survive challenges that might have destroyed it under less capable leadership. However, this success also masked structural weaknesses in the kingdom's political and military systems that became fatal once they were no longer compensated for by exceptional personal leadership. In the broader context of medieval history, Baldwin IV represents the ideal of knightly virtue taken to its logical extreme, a ruler who embodied courage, honor, and devotion to duty, despite facing challenges that would have defeated most of his contemporaries. His willingness to lead his army into battle, even when he was blind, unable to walk, and suffering constant pain from his disease, became a powerful symbol of self-sacrifice in service of a higher cause. The historical significance of Baldwin's reign extends beyond its immediate military and political consequences. His story illustrates the complex interplay between individual agency and historical forces that characterized the medieval period. Despite his remarkable personal achievements, Baldwin ultimately could not overcome the structural disadvantages facing the Crusader states. Their small population, limited resources, and precarious geographic position made their long-term survival extremely difficult regardless of the quality of their leadership. Baldwin IV died knowing that he had done everything in his power to preserve the kingdom entrusted to his care. He had achieved military victories that seemed impossible, maintained political unity in the face of enormous pressures, and inspired loyalty among his subjects that transcended the normal bounds of medieval political relationships. That his achievements proved temporary rather than permanent does not diminish their significance. They represent the triumph of human will and determination over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Leper King's legacy ultimately rests not on what he failed to accomplish, but on what he achieved despite facing challenges that would have overwhelmed most rulers. His story remains one of the most inspiring examples of leadership under adversity in medieval history, demonstrating that true greatness lies not in the absence of obstacles, but in the courage and skill with which they are confronted. In an age that valued physical prowess above all other qualities, Baldwin IV proved that the strength of the human spirit could transcend the limitations of the flesh, creating a legend that continues to inspire and instruct nearly 1,000 years after his death.